Chapter 4 is our first chapter that's really on the biblical books themselves. There are some central things that I want to accomplish with this chapter. The first one is that I want to provide students with an appropriate way to read Genesis, especially chapters 1 through 11. I try to ease them into recognizing the genre of the first 11 chapters by not using the word that fits. That is, I don't use the word myth in the text, though I do have a text box with it in it. Instead, I use the euphemism poetic narrative, which means myth generally. I use that to help students be eased into a non-literal reading of these texts. Too often when students hear myth, they hear falsehood. And I want to try to demonstrate that use of a myth is a way to try to get to truth. And so I avoid that word in this chapter in a way to help students begin to read in new and better ways. The second thing I want to do is to familiarize students with the foundational stories in Genesis, not just those in chapters 1 through 11, but throughout the whole book. These stories often appear in important parts of Western culture, so they simply need to know the stories. Furthermore, these stories set the direction and tone for much else that we're going to see in biblical texts. So knowing who these characters are and how they behave in this text and how they'll be idealized as well in other texts helps us see the direction of the narrative. So these stories help us with biblical interpretation, while at the same time they're needed for cultural literacy. Students often don't know who major characters are, folks like Abraham. So if they don't know these, they'll miss many of the allusions in literature or other media. So these stories help them participate in the broader world. The third thing I want to accomplish in this chapter is to introduce students to seeing the biblical writings as theological documents. Once we make it clear that these texts are not historical or scientific accounts, then we need to talk about what they are and what those kinds of writings intend to accomplish. This chapter becomes the place where students can begin to see how these stories, and the stories throughout the Bible, attempt to both interpret and to shape life.